these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. We have a return guest, Peter Zeihan, on today. I'm really excited about that. And I think it's a good time to have him on. 2023, well, it's not 2023 anymore, but the last year has been pretty interesting in terms of, to say the least, in terms of geopolitics. You're in your third year of war in Ukraine. You've had a lot of interesting developments on that front. You've had Chinese continuing its aggression in the Western Pacific. You've had 2.5 months of high-intensity conflict in the Gaza Strip after Hamas launched a brazen and deadly attack into Israel. Peter, you're not exactly a fortune teller, but you've been known to make some interesting predictions.
Fortune teller adjacent. How about that?
That's exactly. And I'd point people to your YouTube channel to really get some good stuff. I mean, it's really blown up this last year. And we were just talking about that offline. And I was complimenting how you have a very consistent output, and with just the right amount of details, with insights that I think others are just not there to gain. I have actually some questions on this, which is, tell people how you do your research, and like, what's your routine? And like, so do you do a bunch of research and then go hike in the mountains of Colorado and record selfies and like, what? How does
some of that?
Yeah.
I cheat a little bit. One of the problems we have right now is that the media is basically collapsed as a series of institutions that inform. They're more in an advocacy role now. And that is largely because we've adapted poorly to technology. And when I say we, I don't mean Americans. I mean everyone. Every country faces this problem to some degree. It used to be with international news, you would have entire foreign bureaus for every mid-sized news agency on up, from like the Des Moines Register all the way up to AP. Once we got email, a lot of that went away. Once we got faxes and then email, and then ultimately attachments, the staff that you have overseas, they pulled out the stringers, they pulled out the copy editors, and eventually pulled out the editors and just left the reporters. Well, now we're in an age of AI where they don't even feel they need the reporters. So at every stage, the number of eyes that have been on every individual article has shrunk. And so the bullshit detector has gone away. And it's just a handful of people living in a bubble back in New York who are like, yay or nay. And even that's starting to get automated. So all of the people who used to give context to stories and prevents an article from saying something that was just wrong or erratic, that's all gone. All the rails are gone. And so now it's up to us to decide what's true or not. And we haven't all been trained in journalism for 20 years. So we're left with this network that is not nearly as good. My advantage is, before I started doing this 10 years ago, I was part of an institution, Stratfor, that built a constellation, if you will, of over 3,000 local news sources. And so we basically still have that repertoire. And even though half of them are gone, we're going through the rest of them every month. And so we're getting firsthand information from people who are writing with context about local issues, which is something that just isn't present in the US media anymore.
Do you have a team of researchers that helps you with this?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's definitely not a one-man show.
Yeah. Well, it's good stuff, but it varies widely too. I mean, I enjoy your videos talking about Germany and why the German experiment is on its road to collapse. Maybe we can talk about that and the European situation in general. I mean, that's what I want to do with this conversation today, is maybe just do an around the world update. And, maybe hopefully this is something maybe we can do semi-often, and get good insights from you. I want to start off with some, I guess it's not recent news anymore, but the attack that occurred on October 7th, Hamas conducted this horrific attack against Israel. But let's think broader here. Is this something you could have seen coming? Is this something where there were conditions on the ground that had developed over the course of a few years that told anyone paying attention that we need to be on the lookout for a more extreme conflict than we're used to?
Well, let me start with the personal and the horrible. I don't care about Gaza. This is a territory that's 1/10 the size of Rhode Island. It produces nothing, it consumes nothing, it transits nothing. The budget is aid that is dispensed by the UN in Israel. It is a non-factor in most international relations. If you're in Israel, very different story, but I'm usually looking at the big picture. So this is going to sound horrible, but I've been a little annoyed at how much bandwidth this has taken from everybody for something that in the end of the day really doesn't matter very much. We know from intercepts and intel that's come out since that while the Iranians may certainly have nudged this to happen when it did, because they were trying to disrupt some negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia on normalization, this was a homegrown plot. With locally trained people picking up on the tactics that ISIS used to use. It should have been detected months ahead of time. In fact, it looks like now there were some very explicit warnings coming from folks in the IDF and Mossad and Shin Bet going back up to a year. The problem on the Israeli side is governance. How can I say this without pissing off half your audience? Whatever. Matt Gaetz on our side has a reputation for being a bit of a blowhard, but not very competent. Basically, that describes half of the Israeli cabinet right now. They're people who got their positions because the religious parties got the rabbis to tell their congregations to vote for these folks. None of them have any real world experience, and they pretend that they own the defense establishment because they beat their chest a lot. But in reality, they've degraded the military and the intelligence services at every turn and ignored all the warnings that weren't politically convenient for them. And because of that, this happened, and that's horrible. And for Israel, there's some soul searching that has to go down here. But first things first, they have to prevent it from ever happening again. And that means the Gaza war and all the ugliness that's coming from that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they're going to do what they need to do. I mean, people ask me this question, but don't you care about the civilian casualties?
Of course.
Yes, I care, but I'm not.
There's
but I
no
also
version of this that ends
not
happy.
sure.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just not sure I see another choice.
Yeah.
You know, and
as long as Hamas is resting and recruiting in a civilian area, that civilian area is a target, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, it gets to a broader point, and you kind of made this point earlier about just the general lack of analytical thinking when among our population, our worldwide population, when it comes to imbibing news and with the proper context. And one of the critiques I hear a lot about foreign policy is it's usually it's like a utopian critique. Well, why can't we just have peace? Oh. Well, why didn't I think of that? You know, it's like, oh, why didn't I think of that? That's still foolish of me, you know. And there's just sort of, and this happens on they used to happen on the liberal left a lot, and now it's more of like a right wing populist phrase to say, which is,
more things change.
Well, yeah, well, it's you just want to line your pockets and with money from the warmongers and the military industrial complex, and people want war. I mean, there's this real conspiracy out there that there's like lawmakers and politicians and bureaucrats in Washington that are always trying to create war. And like there's two things I always just find troubling with that idea, which is, well, one, it's just nonsense that nobody really wants to create war. I mean, I guess I'd be the closest thing to it because I literally volunteered to go to war. And so if there's anybody who's okay with it, it's people like me who actually volunteer to fight in it. But there's certainly nobody at the top who's like, I really just want a war. Like
no,
it doesn't.
The growth industry is the growth industry is the consulting business around the Pentagon in times of peace, because then there's always a billion things you can get ready for as opposed to one very specific thing that you have to fight.
Right. There's somebody's always selling something, you know, and there's always money to be made. I mean, it doesn't have to be this. And but second of all, it's just the idea that this is a general problem with conspiracies, which is that government officials can work together as well as you think they can. It's just none of it's true. You know, and nobody wants to acknowledge that these issues just are complex, that they require some context, they require some historical thinking, and they require tough decisions. There isn't just this easy button. You know, it's like I don't like either of my decisions, but I do have to make one of them.
Yeah, you basically just described the Middle East going back the last 500 years.
Okay, well, I get back to the Middle East then. So Iran, and I agree with your assessments. And people are always surprised to hear me say this, but I had to say that, yeah, it was homegrown, and this wasn't some pre-planned plot by the Iranians. Were they cheering it? Were they happy? But you have to think of it in terms of their favorite, well, second favorite child. I think their favorite child would be Hezbollah, but their second favorite child did what they trained him to do. They raised him right, and look at him now.
Actually, I wouldn't even say that, because Iran publicly thinks of Hamas as apostates worthy of execution. You got to remember, the Iranians are Persian and Shia, and the Palestinians are Sunni and Arab. They are not friends. They are allies of convenience at most. And so if Iran had been in charge of things, they still would have had no problem burning them to get the outcome that they have right now.
That's something I've kind of wondered about, actually, because I've noted myself that Hamas is Sunni, not Shia, and that matters in Middle Eastern politics. But for some reason, they're still allies with Iran. Do the Iranians hate them? I mean, do they really hate them? I don't know about that.
I would say the
Because they certainly
IRGC and
help
the
them.
mullahs hate almost everyone, because there's no one out there who's Persian and Shia. So there's a hierarchy. Hezbollah may be Arab, but they're also Shia. So, they are a proxy. They are a tool. Hamas is at best something that they've thrown a few resources at as kind of a long haul bet just to see what happens, and it's paid off.
Well, how do you see this playing out with, I hate to use an old familiar term, axis of evil, but I think it helps people understand what we're getting at here when you're thinking about Iran and Russia and China, and this coalition that continues to build against. And what are they against exactly? I think, American domination, whether that's an ideological issue for them or not. I think it's more of a power issue for them. What would you agree? And how do you see
I think
that
all
playing
three of
out?
them have something different that they're going for. Of the three, Iran has the longest legs and is going to be with us well throughout this century and into the next. They would love a world in which the Middle East was rearranged to recognize the fact that they are the superior demographic and military force of the Persian Gulf. The problem with that is that all of the Arabs are bit by bit getting in bed with the Jews of Israel into a broad spectrum intelligence and strategic alliance. And if you get Saudi Arabia to join the UAE and Morocco and Egypt and Jordan, who are already in there, then you've pretty much got a lock on the future of the region, and they've got to do everything they can to break that. The problem they're going to come up with is that the United States just doesn't care as much about the oil anymore. And so threatening, say, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't generate the panic in Washington that it used to. So they've got to look for other tools. And in this case, Hamas was a tool to that end. So from their point of view, they've got a bad hand. They're playing it reasonably well. Iran will be with us. China won't.
So why is that?
The degree of breakdown, I can't see. We just talked last time. It was like June of last year.
Yeah, we talked a lot about it last time, but it's good to refresh.
I think the new data, though, came out in July. So the new data out of China is their birth rate has dropped by 2017 by more than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust.
Wow.
And, clearly there's not a war going on in China. So we're looking at just the Chinese have stopped having kids, period.
Yeah.
And so we know that national dissolution is not that far off in the future. I would argue no more than a decade. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong. And what we're now discovering through all these purges of the military is that there's a Russian-style corruption racket going on in the Chinese military procurement system. And just this morning,
so we found out about the water and the missiles, right?
Oh my God! Yeah, that the hatches that were just bolted on because it's easier maintenance if you don't have to open them, and then the rockets that instead of fuel had water. We have no idea how deep that goes. We have found out in Russia that it goes pretty deep, but in China it's all news. So if their military capacity really is more on a Russian scale than a Chinese scale, and their demographics have already imploded, this is not a country that is going to be with us for much longer.
But does that make them more dangerous with respect to the Taiwan invasion?
If they had somewhere they could strike to solve some of their problems, maybe. But, let's say they decided to go for Taiwan. Let's say they could capture it in 2 weeks, a bit of a reach, but let's say they could do that. Well, and then what happens the next day? because the US now has closed the sea lanes to all their energy and all their exports. So, I mean, you get a deindustrialization collapse and a famine in under a year. That's not a win.
What how do you see these upcoming elections in Taiwan? Is this a bunch of chest thumping by the Chinese and what they'll do or not do?
Taiwanese elections are always a hoot. They're like a Panamanian soap opera. I don't know who's going to win.
How many Panamanian soap operas do you watch?
Everyone I can get my hands on, because they're ridiculous and they're short and they're to the point, and they're done in a season, so it's great. Anyway, it's like disposable Game of Thrones. I don't know who's going to win. The Chinese have always beaten their chests to try to shape the election, and it's always gone the opposite way. So that would suggest that this new mayor, or I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. The guy who runs Foxconn.
Let's see if I have it in my notes. I don't remember either.
Anyway, when he declared they opened tax evasion investigations to every Apple subsidiary in China, and which has had the impact on the trade situation that you would expect. Let's say for a moment that he wins. The Chinese have no problem wrecking half of their own technological system in order to make a political point now. And so I can easily see the Chinese blowing this out, because the wise, stern hand on the rudder that they used to have is gone. And Xi is clearly in the dark about most of the things that are going on in his own country. So you've got the propagandists saying what they think Xi wants to, and then the bureaucrats making up policy on the fly, but none of it's connected anymore.
Right. Yeah. I just find that fascinating. And I always point it out to people because everybody's worried about China. And I say, well, you should be. I mean, but always bet on America in the long run. And it's not because we're just smarter than everybody else. Look, we got a lot of dumb people trying to ruin this great experiment. So many. But we are remarkably stable and lucky for a variety of reasons: resources, geography, demographics, but also a remarkably stable constitutional framework.
Yeah.
One of the youngest countries in the world, oldest constitution. I just always find that a remarkable fact.
Well, what I love is we're one of the youngest countries in the world, but we have one of the oldest governing systems in the world. It's like everyone else has had a coup or a civil war along the way. The only country that's had the same governing system as long as us or longer are the Brits.
Yeah. No, we're lucky. But you got to have some brains in order to remain lucky. And so, our foreign policy matters. How important is the U.S. Navy to all of this? I mean, we've seen a lot of attacks on cargo shipments near Yemen, Straits of Hormuz. You wrote about this in your book a lot, which is, how global trade came to be and how fragile it actually is if no one's there to protect it. And, I'm going to make a statement. You just kind of tell me if I'm right, because I think I am, because I sort of got it from you. But it's essentially, it's a response to a lot of the critics of America World Police. Why are we wasting our taxpayer money protecting so and so shipping lane, which doesn't even have any goods that belong to us? And I'm like, well, because if it becomes normal that somebody other than pirates actually starts taking shipping containers from and actually seizing cargo ships, if that becomes normal, then, well, it becomes pretty costly to do that. And insurance rates to do that will skyrocket. It means all your goods skyrocket in price. And that's if those same goods are even made anymore. Because at a certain price point, it doesn't even make sense to make the thing that you want. And so your entire economy falls apart without the U.S. Navy.
And the more complex the manufactured product, the more steps, the more intermediate products there are, the more vulnerable it is, because you only need one of those steps to be interrupted for the whole chain to stop.
Right.
Which
we found out during COVID.
Yeah, exactly. What we've seen so far with the situation in the Red Sea is we've got some of the least competent terrorists in the world and some of the most useless land in the world have managed to cut off 10, 12% of global shipping, which isn't to say that the Houthis are doing great. It's to give you an idea of how vulnerable the system is, because this is happening while the United States has a naval task force in the air shooting down some of these things. But the Red Sea, on the map, it looks so tiny. But, you're talking about a territory that's triple the size of Texas that you're trying to patrol with like 6 boats. And so the range of interception that you have to engage in to protect it from a determined foe is huge. And this is for a group that doesn't have very impressive hardware. So if something like this, just this scale, were to pick up and move over to, say, Indonesia, we'd already have a global recession, because you can't maneuver around the Strait of Malacca like you can in the Red Sea. And that assumes that no sovereign gets involved, in which case things go to pot really, really fast. This is not something that the United States is capable of fighting anymore. It used to be that we had a 500 ship navy with a lot of small vessels that could have long reach and patrol and cause and what's the word I'm looking for? Instigate convoys.
Yeah.
Now we've got 12 supercarrier battle groups. We don't have enough small vessels to even theoretically patrol a third of the world's oceans, much less all of them. So seeing the United States struggle with this mismatch of resources to taskings when it's just the Houthis, it's a serious taste of things to come.
Yeah, but also you have to wonder at a certain point, there's never enough cops to catch all the bad guys,
Sure.
and so one of the ways you deter bad guys is you make it clear to them that if they do get caught, the punishment is severe. That's difficult to inflict on ragtag groups like the Houthis, and piracy and things like that. It's hard to inflict a deterrence against them, but against a nation, there's at least the threat of deterrence can stop them, and I think that's the only thing. That's what we could hope for. I think the only thing we could hope for is getting our allies around the world, of which we have many, to actually step up and build the capabilities they need to build in order to be a force multiplier for us.
Yeah, see, the problem is there's only two that matter. The Brits and the Japanese, they're the only ones with long reach navies. There are other allies that we have that do have navies, but they can't operate outside of their own region.
Yeah,
And
which
so,
is maybe all we need, at least if it's spread across. It's like a zone defense.
yeah, I mean, it's a nice thought, but we have transoceanic trade involving over 10,000 container ships and 5,000 ships of other types, all sailing every day. So you're talking about billions of container ship miles every year, and only 3 ships can patrol out of region? No.
So when you talk to DoD officials, do you recommend then that we transition our thinking into a higher number, smaller ship type navy to deal with a multitude of
When I
issues?
talk to DoD, I basically make 2 broad recommendations. Number 1 is you have got to get clear guidance from the White House. We have not had what I would consider a real strategic decision between the Joint Chiefs and the presidency since Herbert Walker Bush. And so they're working on guidance that's 35 years old at this point, based on a military structure and a global structure that have long since disappeared. The second is don't sell yourself short and spend 1% of your time thinking about what happens the day after you win. Because we didn't do that for the Soviet Union, and we are still cleaning up that mess. I would like us to have some proactive conversations about what a post-China Asia looks like.
Yeah, that would be good. Required a lot more than the DoD though. But if you're good luck with those conversations, getting the grand strategy in place. I'm not sure we're gonna see that anytime soon. It doesn't really matter who wins the election.
But I think you underlined a fact. I know, let's say that we wanted to go back to the 1980s vessel count and type. If we start today, we'll have that in 30 years. It's just that's the time turnaround for building vessels of size.
Yeah, even smaller, simpler ones. I had a concerning conversation with someone from the British Ministry of Defense not too long ago when we had a congressional delegation out there, and I asked them what was their plan, they and Europe's plan, NATO's plan to effectively replace the U.S. in the European theater in 50 years. Right. Given the threats they now see from Russia and what happened here, has there been a mindset change wherein you feel that you need more capabilities? And can you tell me what sort of capabilities you're thinking you need? Not to say that the U.S. will just disappear. We won't. That wasn't the point I was making, but to complement our capabilities, so that it's not completely on us. And I did not get an answer.
No, it's like, now, if you would have asked that question of, say, the Belgians or the Germans or the French back during the Iraq War in 2003 to 2009, you would have gotten an answer. It would have been a stupid answer. But they were thinking about it then in a different context, because that was back when the Russians and the French and the Germans were doing all those joint press conferences about how the United States is done in Europe. We need to make it a new strategic architecture and blah, 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 blah. Now that we've actually had a real fight, the Europeans, almost to every individual country, have come to the conclusion that there is no security for Europe that doesn't involve the United States. Now, they're all taking that lesson to heart in different ways. But even the French are now talking openly about how the bilateral relationship between Paris and Washington is the bedrock of European defense. And while they do want more European strength in decision-making, there's no agreement on what that looks like. But there is agreement that working with the United States is just simpler, faster, and more effective.
Yeah, but it's also unsustainable for us, politically, economically, financially. It becomes, the burden becomes too big. And you made this point. It's, there's a grow there. Well, I don't know if it's growing. I think it's always there, but there's an isolationist bent to our politics. That's like, I think it's deeply naive, and I know you agree with that, because it assumes we live in a world that mirrors, the 1500s, where everything is a lifetime away, and you really do manufacture everything at home, because everything you manufacture is made of like wood, or so it's you don't have a super complex life. And now things are different, and it's to help people understand foreign policy, they also need an education in global economics, and just kind of like how complicated like literally this little travel coffee mug plastic lid is. This thing's made of plastic. It probably it could have come from feedstock that was actually produced here in Texas.
Probably was.
Yeah, and so that looks like little plastic pellets, produced here. But then we send those to China, because we can't actually do the plastic mold injecting to make this thing here. I mean, we could, but it's too costly, and we just don't do it. And so we just send it to China.
Yeah, we focus on more value-added industries.
And then they ship it back here. And so, like, that's just that thing. And it's so simple. But it requires a global economy, whether it's China or hopefully maybe Mexico in the future, which I want to get to Mexico here in a minute. And so, yeah, it's concerning, when the Europeans aren't thinking in terms of it's not that we want them to replace our security umbrella. It's that we want them to complement it a little bit better.
Yeah, well, I'd argue that the numbers and the politics are moving in the right direction. Every European country is in the process of expanding their military, some, like the Swedes and the Poles, by just mammoth volumes. Even Spain, dangling way out on the edge, who has nothing to fear from the Russians, is getting in on the act. Now, we can all argue that it's too slow and it's too late and all that, and that's fine. But things are moving in the right direction. There's also an understanding in Europe that it all begins with ammo. And if they can't keep the stream of ammo to Ukraine functional, then none of the rest of this is even worth talking about. And they've discovered the United States can't expand its ammo production any faster than it is. So we're actually seeing first-line industrial build-out across Europe for that. Now, again, too little, too late, too slow. We can all argue about that, but they are moving in the right direction. And for the last 9 months, they've given more military aid to the Ukrainians than we have.
Talk to me about Germany. You put out an interesting video on Germany, basically talking about how Germany is on the verge of, or will eventually collapse as a European power, for a variety of reasons. Can you tell us why?
Sure. So Germany was the first country to urbanize at scale when they went through their own industrial revolution around the turn of the previous century, so 1900. And so they were the first country to have the majority of their population living in cities. And when you live in a city, you generally have fewer kids because they're more of an expense. They're not helping you on the farm. They're not free labor. Then we had World War II, which obviously dented their demographics a bit. And in the aftermath of World War II, all of a sudden they had access to the globalized world. It was like they had won World War II and World War I and every other war they'd ever fought by an order of magnitude and access to everything. And they were able to take their German acumen and focus it entirely on economics. In fact, we told them they had to. We told them they couldn't have a military that was independent. So 70 years of that, they just stopped having kids. And now they're running out of people. Not running out of children, that's 40 years in the past. not running out of young workers. That's 20 years in the past. They're now running out of people in their 50s. And have this big bulge like us, the baby boomers, moving in retirement, but there's nothing below it. So the model that the Germans have developed over that 70 years is precision, high quality manufacture, older workers, and then exporting it to a wealthy or a developing country that can buy the stuff at scale. So that's been us for the finished goods, and it's been China for the manufacturing capacity. They basically make the machines that the Chinese use to make everything. Well, the Chinese system is failing. We're having trade tensions now between Europe and China. The United States is more interested in protecting its own domestic market, and the Germans are aging out. Every pillar that has supported their entire system is breaking, and then the Ukraine war comes along and cuts the energy line too. So none of this works anymore, and they have about 3 years to figure out a new plan. And if they can do that in 3 years, they will be the first country that has done this in less than 30.
So what does that plan look like? Does it mean that they have to find a new market for, say, their high-end manufacturing products? And what is that?
Assuming they can cut a political deal with the United States, that would maintain market access to North America. But that requires the French going along with it because it's in the European Union. So that's, I don't want to say impossible, but very difficult. A better plan that is more of an extension of what they're familiar with is, what's the best way to put this? Since 1992, when Central Europe left the Soviet sphere and entered the European sphere, the Germans have basically done to Poland and the Czech Republic and others a lot of what we have done with the Mexicans, and that they've built a differentiated supply chain system where the Germans do the high-end stuff and the Poles do the medium-level stuff, and maybe the Romanians do the low-end stuff. And that type of manufacturing network has been very effective. The logical extension when you're starting to run out of your own workforce is to move more and more of the value add, more of the infrastructure, more of the industrial plant, more of the technology into a place like Poland, where they've got 20 million workers. So you can produce while you kind of take a Japanese style approach and you do a manage from a distance. You remember total quality management, that term ring a bell? It was something the Japanese basically designed as an economic and a political tool to assuage our concerns about trade imbalances and to ultimately build products where they were sold in the United States. So you transfer some of the manufacturing jobs and the skills associated to a partner country. In this case, instead of Japan to the United States, it would be Germany to Poland.
Yeah, that's interesting because you've talked about this before.
It's a difficult model, but it's not impossible.
How Japan had these same problems with demographics, but somehow has created a model that's sustainable. Is it sustainable for the
It's doing pretty well so far, but forever's a long time. And they also started on this in the early 80s, whereas the Germans are only thinking about it now.
Yeah, but it requires stable partners.
It did. It also required global growth and no energy crisis and good political relationships and no wars.
Yeah. Focus on one of my main focuses is on South America. I'm on the intelligence. Since we last spoke, I now have a spot on the Intelligence Committee, so I see a lot of scary and terrifying things there, and but also many uplifting things. So I let people know both. But my focus there is because we all sort of divvy up into geographic focuses on the committee, which at least guides our travel. And mine is South America because I think I have a lot of experience there just growing up in Colombia, but also I think it's too often ignored by American leadership.
Fair enough.
Mexico especially with the growth of cartels. I mean, how closely do you monitor focus on the situation in Mexico? We have, our DEA administrator saying at least half the states in Mexico are basically cartel states. I would agree with that assessment from what I know. How sustainable is that?
We're going to have a reckoning. There's no way around that. Mexico is now our #1 trading partner. It's a position they're going to have for at least the next 60 years. And that assumes that the politics are wrong. If we get the politics right, it's going to be a much more robust relationship. The problem we have, to be perfectly blunt, is that Mexico needs a new constitution. They have one of the oldest ones in the world, and they basically ignored it during PRI rule, when it was basically a
Mm.
one-party dictatorship. And now they're actually enforcing it while it's a multi-party democracy, but the Constitution wasn't designed for that. And I don't mean
Mm.
this as a slam on the Mexicans. It's like, documents that are over a century old usually required a tune-up. The US Constitution is a very rare thing, largely because of the separation of powers between local, state, and federal governments. The Mexicans are trying to basically do this on the fly without a law of the land. And until they get that right, it's really hard to have rule of law.
What are some of the aspects of their constitution that are problematic?
It imagines a world where trade is not a thing and private property is more of a privilege than a right. And it
Mm.
makes it very difficult to regulate corporations or private interests without the government basically putting a kill switch into anything. And that is something the current government has been doing a fair amount of. So I'm not suggesting that they need to follow the American model. There's dozens of models out there that work, but you need a document that was designed in a time that had electricity and reflects that that has an effect on society.
Yeah, and I guess there's some basic principles in governing, like the respect of private property rights and free enterprise and things
Yeah, I mean,
that
obviously,
have
we think that
shown to
would be a
do
good
pretty well.
idea. They need to decide that for themselves.
Yeah, well, but it would work there because I mean, the Mexican people, just as a culture, as a population, is a pretty entrepreneurial, working class type of spirit to it. It seems to me it would work, but as you said, especially with AMLO, they've been very, yeah, I would say aggressive against foreign and direct investment for sure, and any kind of privately owned enterprise. Um, the cartel aspect, I guess, it's I guess that's the petri dish for cartels to thrive in
Yeah.
because they can take advantage of that fact, and
Fuzzy
how we
laws
get rid
make
of
it very
that,
easy for the underworld to do well.
right? I think it's only a matter of time before that just, well, it's already spilt over in terms of fentanyl, being a main product of them that's killing tens of thousands of Americans, which is what our focus is on. Um, One of the things in their constitution is that they do not allow any foreign forces on Mexican territory, right? Because they have a long memory of 1845 era, and no
It
war with the
wasn't
United
just
States.
us, to be clear. It's like everyone in Europe took their hand at it too.
Yeah, there was, but the Mexicans, they think about it like it was yesterday.
Fair enough.
And I let people know that the politics there are very different than say Colombia, where we've had a long-standing security relationship with the Colombians, and
Well,
and
and the
I
Colombians are
personally
still a little
watched.
touchy about Panama.
They are, but they're just, but as far as you being open to U.S. partnerships, we've been
Right.
doing
No,
it for
yeah,
30
it's
plus
a much more
years.
collegial, friendly relationship. I agree.
And it's worked. It's turned that, it's not perfect by any means, but I've personally watched the country develop over the last 20 years. I went to high school there in 1998 to 2002, and that was a pretty dangerous time in Colombia.
Mm.
And now it's very different. And a lot of that is because of the security relationship, and we cannot get that with Mexico. They won't allow it. Because of that chip on their shoulder, plus their constitution. But of course, like, they could change it. They could make changes, or they could just ignore it as they have in the past. But to me, it's, and I gotten, I think, unfair blowback for suggesting this, that you need some kind of American military force to deal with the cartels. It doesn't mean a unilateral invasion that is
Yeah, I would not
simultaneously going to
recommend
war
that
with
either.
No. I mean, but you absolutely need a Colombian style relationship where you are advising, assisting, and even accompanying, if they'd allow us, on operations to deal with the cartels, because to me that's a form of deterrence. It sends a message that the cartels have finally gotten the attention of the U.S. military, because you're finally killing tens of thousands of Americans, which has not been the case until the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, the problem with the fentanyl crisis is, I mean, I'm speaking a little bit out of area here, is my understanding is that the majority of the fentanyl that's coming in is specifically a product of the Sinaloa cartel. And while there are no good guys among the cartels, if there was one cartel that we would want to survive, it would be that one, mostly because they don't kill everybody. They see drug smuggling as a business, whereas the other cartels, whether it's the Zetas or New Generation, I mean, those are the bloodthirsty, murdering bastards.
Yeah,
And so it's weird,
that's all
ironic,
true.
tragic. I'm not sure quite what the right word is, but the one that is causing the most direct deaths of Americans is the one that would probably be an unofficial ally on the other side of the border.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call them an ally, but
Yeah,
they're
for
the
the right
better,
words.
they're the more traditional type of cartel. Yes, the new generation Jalisco cartel is the bloodthirsty, militarized cartel who wants to go to war with everyone. But they also produce fentanyl. And what's interesting, and the reason I say deterrence can actually work here is because we've seen evidence of it. We've seen the Sinaloa cartel actively kill and murder outsiders, people outside of their network who are producing fentanyl, which shows that there is, and they do this for a couple of reasons. One, I think because fentanyl's gotten too cheap and they want to reduce the supply. So there's the more selfish reason. But openly what they say is we don't do it they're lying, but they say we don't do it anymore because of the pressure put on us, and we want to maintain our business, and we want the government to leave us alone. That's an indicator to me that this problem can be solved with just at least the threat of force without even actually taking action. But you need Mexican cooperation to do that. It's
I'm pretty
absolutely
sure we'd
essential.
have to take some credible action for the threat to mean anything. But you're absolutely right about the Sinaloa. I mean, this is the group that basically had an alliance with the Peña government against the other cartels. And I don't mean to suggest that seeking a drug war in Mexico is the goal of policy here, but it did break most of the others and brought the death rate down.
What do you think about the general trend in South America towards this sort of like a populist socialist Maduro type figure that keeps popping up across the continent, with a notable exception in Argentina recently? But even in Colombia, our longstanding kind of conservative ally under Petro has veered wildly left, at least in rhetoric. I'm not so sure. Luckily, not as much in policy. But is this just the way it is?
Unfortunately, yeah, because of the geography of the area, there's so little good land to work with, and it tends to be privately held by a group of oligarchs or very powerful families. And so when we talk about the split on economics here between the left and the right and the haves and the have-nots, our haves and our have-nots are actually not too far apart. In Latin America, the inequality of the system is much higher. And so you really do have an argument between the top people at the top who own a lot of things and the people on the bottom who really don't. And so you will always have this pendulum swinging between those two groups. It'll go in the direction of redistribution until it gets out of control. Then it goes into the direction of free market principles until it becomes too politically ossified. And then it goes back and forth and back and forth. And unfortunately, unless you had a very serious overhaul of the economic system first, I'm afraid that's how it's going to be. Now, the country that is closest to getting out of that trap is Mexico. And that's largely because of NAFTA. Because if you look at most Latin American countries, most of the international trade they have is raw materials, and there's very little value add. If you look at Mexico, it's the same percentage of GDP that's raw materials, but then they have that much again that is value-added manufacturing. And that's generating a middle class. You have a middle class, the politics don't swing quite as aggressively anymore.
Yeah. That's certainly my hope. I always say, with all my chest thumping against the cartels, which I think is perfectly warranted, I also always note in the same sentence that if I were to pick one country in the world and make it 10 times better in every single way, prosperity and safety and all that, I would always choose Mexico. It should be our number one priority as far as foreign policy. It's that important to us.
Yeah, I agree completely.
I know you got to go soon. Maybe one last generalized question on the future of energy.
Sure.
And since we last spoke, I mean, my positions on this are always really clear about the need for a common sense and energy mix. From my perspective, I do think the conversation around climate change and the alarmism and the need to rush to a renewable only kind of future, I think has been beaten back into a more normal conversation over the last few years. And there's perhaps a variety of reasons for that, some of which are because I think good, prominent voices have made the arguments correctly, as opposed to it just being an argument about whether climate change is real or not. More of an argument about energy mix and energy density properties and what's feasible and what isn't for a growing population and a growing energy demand. But also there's the lessons of COVID. There's the lessons from Germany. What's your general take on how we should look at energy mix in the future or energy policy in the future? How are we going to get all the raw materials that we supposedly need if we're going to move to this battery operated system full of electric cars and battery backup systems for our solar and wind plants? Is that even feasible, or are we just
Well, first of all, no, it's not feasible. We need triple the copper, 10 times the nickel, 20 times the lithium, and it's a long list. As a species, we've never more than doubled anything in a 10-year time frame. So it was never going to happen in the way that a lot of people envision. Now, you change the technologies, especially say a battery technology, and I reserve the right to change my mind. But right now, there's nothing that has reached prototype stage that looks better than lithium, and lithium is crap. So that's going to be the end of the EV system, and that's going to put sharp limitations on what we can do with green tech. And what's changed, and I think the reason we're seeing a more mature relationship conversation about this is in the last 4 years, the cost of capital has tripled because the baby boomers are taking their money and retiring. And since all green projects have to be paid for upfront, that means that the cost of their financing has tripled. It's like you build a natural gas plant, 80%, 60 to 80% of the cost of that plant over its life is buying the fuel. So you pay as you go. But you build a solar panel and all of the cost is up front, so you have to finance it. And so simply that's one little thing. The cost of capital increasing has made everybody take a much more realistic view of what we can do with these things. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing red states, of all places, really get into the green transition from a generation point of view, because just by happenstance, the red states, as a rule, have much better geography for solar or wind than the blue states. And so the dollar stretches further. So you do this in Oklahoma and Texas and South Dakota. You don't do it in New York or Vermont or Oregon.
Right, and yet that's the places where they seem to be rushing toward it more than anyone. In Texas, it's happened not because of some overarching policy, but because of the reasons you stated.
The technologies work in Texas, at least the western half.
Yeah, there's enough space for it. It doesn't bother anybody. The tax credits certainly make it more feasible. I'm not sure they would be as feasible without the tax credits.
Fair.
Now, the problem we run into Texas is what I say is there's still a ceiling. There's still a ceiling on how much of my energy mix I want to be unreliable energy. Because then you end up in a real problem when you have an excessive demand spike, say in the summer and the winter, like we did with Uri. And so there is, now what that cap is, I'm not sure, but maybe a cap isn't the right word. Maybe at least you need to say that you have a base of energy that you can't go below. Right. A base of reliable energy that you can't go below.
I would say rule of thumb, anytime you get past about 1/3 being intermittent, you're going to have some real problems in terms of cost maintenance and reliability.
Right. That's kind of where we are in Texas.
Now, a couple things, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, within a year, the new wind turbines will be 1 kilometer tall. And those basically tap wind currents that don't stop. So wind is moving bit by bit into the non-intermittent category. So solar, obviously.
1 kilometer tall?
1 kilometer tall. Yeah. It's like the ones in Iowa where I'm from are already over 750 meters.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
That is wildly high.
Yeah. And you're going to hate this one. A functional green transition requires a much better grid with better long-range transmission. For that to happen in Texas, ERCOT has to loosen up a little bit.
Well, we also just need to build, don't you just need to build a shit ton more transmission lines with a lot more copper and a lot more steel? But you have to be able to get out of Texas to other zones with good energy generation, whatever that type of energy generation happens to be. And then all of a sudden you've got the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and the Texas grid, and they need to be able to talk to each other a lot better. Oh, you mean actually connect them? Yeah. Now, Texas has made this look almost easy because the east or western half of the state is nearly empty. Dallas-Fort Worth is, if it wasn't for the fact that Dallas-Fort Worth is in a massive building boom and will be for 20 years, it would probably be the first major metro in the United States to go 100% green. It's at the edge of the world's best solar zone and the world's best wind zone. Yeah, I could see that. But a much longer conversation about the politics of ERCOT connecting to the grid, because but the benefits of obviously the reason we don't do it is because it avoids any federal oversight of
Oh
our
yeah,
electric grid,
exactly. Yeah,
which
and I
there's
can't
a lot of,
imagine Texas suddenly changing their mind on that.
it's hard to imagine. What's again, I know you got to go. Well, one last question. Or do you have to go?
I've got a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, but my last question would just be, what haven't we talked about? What should we be thinking about from a geopolitical standpoint, whether that's global finance or upcoming elections that are going to change the world? We didn't even talk about our own upcoming elections. I mean,
Take
I'll
45
let you
minutes right
choose.
there.
So, yeah, I'll let you choose. Like, what are people not talking about enough that is on your radar that you think should be on others' radars?
Sure. So once you kind of come to grasp the concepts for why the Chinese are going away, there are three things that we're going to need at volume very, very soon. Number one, we need more power everywhere. Because if we're going to just replace the manufacturing that we used to get from China with stuff we do here, we need 50% more strength in the grid, 50% more power generation. That's historically significant by any way you look at it. Number two, we need to at least quadruple the amount of materials processing as we have right now, because right now most of that's done in China as well. It's not doesn't take a long time to get set up. It's not very expensive even. It's based on technology that's a century old, but the Chinese have cornered that market. And then third, we need to build out our machinery capacity. Think of machinery as the stuff that builds other stuff. Right now, Houston is the world's second largest producer of that. They need to produce at least twice as much, and preferably yesterday. So those are all three growth sectors that we know how to tackle with what we have. And the sooner we get started on it, the better. And I've got confidence we're going to pull this off, because over the last 3 years, industrial construction spending in this country has more than quadrupled. So, we're capable of doing it with limited government involvement. And when the government does get involved, say, like via the CHIPS Act, it only moves faster. So there's room here for everyone.
What are the chances you think that manufacturing base, that sort of that middle processing part cornered by the Chinese, starts to move to places like Mexico? I mean, it already is to some extent.
No, it's going to be in the United
gonna...
States. If I had to put it on a map, I'd say Louisiana and Texas, the same place where the refining happens, because it's very energy intensive, and you need a certain appreciation for loose environmental laws in order to smelt things.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm skeptical of it happening in the U.S. It depends on the administration at the time.
Well,
but I mean, one of the reasons it's always been cheaper in China is because they have no environmental laws and labor laws. I mean, who knows how much?
True, and they subsidize it. But you're not going to put this in Boston, because that's not where the power is cheap. The power is cheapest in the area where the shale natural gas comes from, and that's going to be the southern coast.
Yeah. Well, let's hope for that. Go Texas. So you're bullish on Texas. I mean, that's where we should
ridiculously
end, right?
so. Yes.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's a smart guy. All right, Peter, I'll let you get back to your extensive research and working on your next informative video for the public, because the media won't give it to you. So,
well, we'll talk politics next time.
Yeah, we can do that. Like I said, I'd like to have you on regularly. Peter, appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Take care.